Welcome back, dear friends, and a warm hello to the first-time visitors of my channel. The Malfoy family, as portrayed in the Harry Potter saga, first appeared as classic antagonists, devoted followers of Voldemort, obsessed with status, power, and blood purity. But the truth, as always, is more complex. Behind the arrogance and the cold stares, there were moments when the Malfoys revealed glimpses of something deeper, something human. Acts of compassion, mercy, and even courage emerged, giving us a rare look beneath the mask of icy indifference. Let's revisit the moments when the Malfoys showed us their hearts. Perhaps after this, you'll see them in a new light. Enjoy the journey. Number 1. Narcissa saved Harry Potter. Though Narcissa Malfoy is often counted among the Death Eaters, she was never one in the truest sense. Her loyalty did not lie with Voldemort, but with her son. And it was her motherly love that led to a decision that changed the course of the war. When Voldemort asked her to confirm Harry's death, she whispered a single question: "Is Draco alive?" Upon hearing that he was, she lied to the Dark Lord, declaring Harry dead, not for his sake, but to reach her son. In doing so, she saved the boy who lived. Number 2. Draco didn't expose Harry at Malfoy Manor. If Draco had been fully loyal to Voldemort, he would have recognized Harry immediately, even with his disfigured face. After 6 years at Hogwarts together, he knew those features too well. But Draco hesitated. He didn't confirm Harry's identity. It was a risky move, one that could have cost his family dearly. Voldemort already distrusted the Malfoys. Yet Draco chose silence. Whether consciously or not, he rejected the path of absolute darkness. Number 3, he saved Goyle during the Room of Requirement battle. Draco's bond with Crabbe and Goyle always seemed more like a partnership of convenience than true friendship. He was the leader, they were his shadows. But when the Room of Requirement erupted in cursed fire and Goyle lost consciousness, Draco didn't run. Instead, he pulled his unconscious companion to safety, risking his own life in the process. It wasn't fear of loss that moved him. It was an act of instinctive humanity few expected from Lucius Malfoy's pampered son. Number 4. Lucius and Narcissa refused to fight at the Battle of Hogwarts. Yes, the Malfoys had stood beside Voldemort. But when the final battle came, they made a different choice. They didn't fight. Some may call it cowardice, but perhaps it was something else. Clarity, a final sliver of humanity. They no longer sought power. They only wanted their son to survive, to escape the madness. In the end, they chose not to spill blood for ideals they no longer believed in. Number 5. Draco became a Death Eater to protect his family. It's easy to condemn this decision, but consider the position the Malfoys were in. Disgraced, humiliated, and kept under Voldemort's thumb. To preserve even a shred of protection for his parents, Draco had to put on the black robes. He didn't want to. He was afraid, overwhelmed, torn, and yet he endured. Not every teenager could carry such a burden without completely breaking. Draco remained flawed, but he remained human. Number 6. He couldn't kill Dumbledore. In The Half-Blood Prince, Draco was given a mission from which he could not walk away: kill Albus Dumbledore. He prepared, plotted, snuck into the castle, but when the moment came, he couldn't do it. Dumbledore stood before him, unarmed, weary, and Draco lowered his wand. He couldn't do it. He saved his soul that night and gave Snape the opportunity to complete the act for reasons far greater. That moment was pivotal. Evil did not win in the boy's heart. Number 7, he stopped Crabbe from killing Harry and Hermione. During the chaos in the Room of Requirement, Crabbe was ready to unleash an unforgivable curse on Harry and Hermione. Draco stopped him, technically because Voldemort wanted Harry alive, but it felt like more than that. He didn't want them to die. He had grown up with them, whether it was sympathy, regret, or simple reason. It was a step toward the light. Number 8. He defied his parents and chose love. In The Cursed Child, Draco is a grown man. He's married to Astoria Greengrass, a pureblood, yes, but one with a gentler, more tolerant worldview. His parents didn't approve. They envisioned a different future for their son. But Draco made his choice. He didn't blindly follow family tradition or inherited prejudice. He built a life and a family based not on ideology, but on love. Number 9. Lucius tried to protect Draco from Voldemort's wrath. Lucius Malfoy was a man of pride, politics and power, but when Voldemort handed Draco the order to kill Dumbledore, all of that crumbled. Lucius, imprisoned in Azkaban after the disaster at the Department of Mysteries, could only watch as his son was pulled into a game meant to punish, not to test. He knew Voldemort had no faith in Draco. The mission was a death trap, and even behind bars, Lucius tried to act. He sent messages through old allies, pleaded with Snape, and begged Narcissa to protect their son by any means necessary. "He's just a boy," he had once whispered, when no one was listening. But Voldemort wasn't interested in boys, only pawns. In Half-Blood Prince, we see Draco's growing fear, his weight loss, his silence. It's not hard to imagine the whispers Lucius tried to send from his cell. He may have been a coward in the eyes of many, but for Draco, Lucius would have broken every rule. His love wasn't loud or heroic, it was desperate and hidden. When Lucius returned from prison, he was a changed man, hollowed by failure and guilt. But one thing remained: his son. And in the ruins of Malfoy Manor, where pride once ruled, it was fear for Draco's life that consumed him most. Number 10. Narcissa helped Snape keep Draco alive. The fire crackled low in Spinner's End. Narcissa Malfoy stood before Severus Snape, her face drawn with desperation. "You will look after him, won't you?" she whispered. Her son, Draco, had been given an impossible task: to kill Albus Dumbledore. Everyone knew it was a death sentence. Voldemort didn't expect success. He expected sacrifice. Narcissa knew this. She didn't trust anyone, but she trusted Snape, or at least she trusted his promise. That night, she made him swear the unbreakable vow. "Will you protect him from harm?" she asked. "I will," Snape replied, sealing a pact that would tie their fates together. The moment was quiet, but it shook the war's foundations. Narcissa had gone against the Dark Lord's wishes. She had involved a man known for his secrecy in a deal that demanded absolute loyalty, not to Voldemort, but to her son. She risked everything. If Voldemort had found out, both she and Snape would have been executed without a second thought. But it didn't matter. Narcissa wasn't acting as a Death Eater. She was acting as a mother, and that made her dangerous in a different way. Number 11. Draco returned Harry's wand after the Battle of Hogwarts. The fires of the Battle of Hogwarts had gone cold. Rubble still lined the corridors. Wands lay broken, bodies buried, names remembered in silence. Amid the quiet aftermath, Draco Malfoy approached Harry Potter, not with insults, not with pride, but with a wand in his hand. "This belongs to you," he said. It was a simple gesture, no ceremony, no witnesses, just Draco holding out the wand Harry had lost in the chaos. And in that moment, something changed between them. Draco didn't owe Harry anything. He could have kept the wand as a trophy or returned it through someone else. But he chose to face Harry directly, to return what wasn't his. It wasn't just a wand, it was a sign of trust, of respect, and, in Draco's quiet way, of gratitude. Harry had saved his life more than once during the war, and instead of demanding repayment, he had let Draco and his family walk free. This return was Draco's answer to that mercy. There's no direct quote in the books describing this moment, but J.K. Rowling left room for stories like this to exist in the silence after battle. In the Deathly Hallows, we see Draco disarmed, broken, and walking away from the wreckage of everything he was taught to believe. The boy who once mocked Harry in the Great Hall now stood as a man, changed. The wand returning to its owner wasn't just about magic. It was about what came after, about letting go of the past. Number 12. Lucius and Narcissa raised Scorpius with different values. Scorpius Malfoy smiled as he waved goodbye to Albus Potter on platform 9 3/4. The two boys, unlikely best friends, stood side by side, untouched by the war that had once divided their families. Scorpius wasn't like the Malfoys of old. He was gentle, curious, and kind. He admired Hermione Granger and felt no shame in saying so. He had no interest in blood status or family rank. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because Lucius and Narcissa, once proud defenders of pure blood ideals, chose to let the past die in silence. They had seen enough. The war cost them everything: status, power, certainty. Narcissa nearly lost her son. Lucius was broken by Voldemort's control. And when Scorpius was born, they faced a choice: pass down the same bitterness or protect him from it. They chose the latter. In The Cursed Child, Draco says, "Scorpius is the most important thing, and he's nothing like me." That difference was nurtured at home, not hidden. Narcissa, who once judged Andromeda for marrying a Muggle-born, now watched her grandson befriend the son of Harry Potter and said nothing to stop it. Lucius, ever the proud patriarch, stayed quiet, but he never interfered. He didn't scold Scorpius for his interests. He didn't try to mold him into another Malfoy heir. His silence was permission, his acceptance subtle but real. Scorpius grew up surrounded by ghosts of the past, but never haunted by them. He read widely, spoke kindly, and questioned everything. And Lucius and Narcissa, once symbols of superiority, became quiet guardians of his freedom to choose. Number 13. Draco admitted his family's mistakes and reconciled with Harry and Ron. Draco Malfoy stood across from Harry Potter at the Ministry of Magic. Older now, his face thinner, his voice calmer, no sneers, no sarcasm, just a quiet, "I was wrong about a lot of things." The words hung in the air like a spell no one expected to hear. It wasn't dramatic, there was no applause. But in that simple admission, Draco broke a chain that had wrapped around him since childhood. Hatred, pride, family legacy, he dropped them all at Harry's feet. And Potter, ever the boy who lived with mercy in his chest, nodded. They weren't friends, not in the way Ron and Hermione were. But there was something new between them, respect. In The Cursed Child, Draco says plainly, "My son makes friends with your son, Harry. My son is happy, so I'm happy." That alone speaks volumes. It wasn't about their past anymore. It was about their children. And when Scorpius and Albus were in danger, Draco didn't hesitate. He worked side by side with Harry and even Ron, trusting them with what he valued most. There were no insults, no old rivalries, just three fathers doing the right thing. Years ago, Draco would have laughed at the idea. He would have spat the word Weasley with contempt. But now he shared strategy with Ron, even thanked him. He didn't excuse his family's role in the war. He didn't try to explain it away. He simply owned it. And in doing so, he gave himself the chance to become someone new. Not the scared boy who followed orders, not the arrogant teenager desperate for attention, but a man who knew better and showed it. Number 14. Narcissa secretly supported Andromeda after the war. The war was over, but grief lingered in the quiet corners of wizarding homes. At the edge of a garden filled with broken toys and unanswered questions, Andromeda Tonks sat alone. She had lost her daughter, Nymphadora, and her son-in-law, Remus Lupin. Only little Teddy remained. No one expected help from the Black family. They had disowned Andromeda years ago when she married a Muggle-born, but one evening a letter came. No return address. Just her name in a delicate, familiar script. Inside was gold, enough to buy food, clothes, healing potions, and a second letter followed a week later. This one carried just a single line for Teddy, from family. The letters came quietly, never signed. But Andromeda knew the handwriting. She remembered it from childhood, when she and her sisters passed notes beneath the table during dull dinners. Narcissa's hand was as elegant as ever. And the help didn't stop. A small basket of potion ingredients arrived each month. Teddy's winter cloak was of better quality than Andromeda could ever afford. There was no conversation, no reconciliation, just action, just quiet, stubborn love from a sister who had once turned her back, but never fully closed the door. The Malfoys never spoke of it. Lucius would not have approved. Their name was still stained from the war. But Narcissa no longer cared for appearances. She had seen the price of loyalty to blood purity. She had nearly lost her son to it. And now she was choosing something different. She didn't do it for redemption or praise. She did it because, at the end of all things, Andromeda was still her sister. In a world rebuilding from ashes, Narcissa rebuilt something too, an invisible bridge between broken lives. Number 15, Lucius tried to stop Bellatrix at Malfoy Manor. Bellatrix Lestrange's wand was pointed at Hermione's throat, her voice rising with manic delight as she carved the word mudblood into the girl's skin. It was one of the most disturbing scenes in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. But hidden in the shadows of Malfoy Manor, a pair of pale eyes watched, troubled, tense, and filled with something uncharacteristic for Lucius Malfoy. Fear, perhaps even regret. He stood near the fireplace, silent, his face pale not from pride, but from discomfort. While Bellatrix roared with sadistic joy, Lucius avoided her gaze, his fingers twitching around his cane as if battling himself. Lucius didn't intervene directly. He couldn't. Voldemort was watching them all in a sense, and Bellatrix was his most devoted servant. But J.K. Rowling lets us glimpse his discomfort through subtle clues. Lucius was standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, not watching, the book tells us. In a house where cruelty had once been currency, Lucius now looked like a man desperate to keep control. His world was crumbling, his wand had been taken by Voldemort, his home turned into a prison, and now his own kin was torturing a girl on his carpet. It was no longer about power, it was about surviving the consequences. There is a moment when Bellatrix demands to know where the sword of Gryffindor came from, and Hermione screams. Lucius flinches. Narcissa shifts uncomfortably beside him. Draco can barely meet Hermione's eyes. Lucius makes a feeble suggestion. My lord should be informed. A weak attempt to delay the madness. Bellatrix ignores him. But the line hangs there, cold and hollow. It was a whisper of defiance from a man who once ruled the room. He was no longer the proud, pure-blood aristocrat. Number 16. Draco regretted Crabbe's death despite his betrayal. Draco Malfoy had grown up believing in pure blood supremacy, shadowed by the name and influence of his father, Lucius Malfoy. But by the time the final battle for Hogwarts erupted, the boy who once taunted Harry Potter in the hallways had become something else, something torn, weary, and quietly fractured. And in that fractured space there was room for sorrow, for regret, even for guilt. One of the names that lingered in his thoughts after the war, whispering through sleepless nights, was Vincent Crabbe. Vincent had been more than a sidekick. He'd been a constant, one of the two pillars always flanking Draco through his Hogwarts years, alongside Gregory Goyle. They laughed together, taunted first years together, sat at the same tables, and shared the same prejudices. But Crabbe had changed. Not all at once, not obviously. There were cracks that appeared slowly, dangerous thoughts, bitter resentment, a growing aggression. And Draco, caught in his own spiraling fear as Voldemort tightened his grip on the world, didn't see how deep those cracks had run. In the room of requirement during that fateful battle, the three former Slytherins cornered Harry, Ron, and Hermione. It should have been simple: capture Potter, gain favour, survive. But Crabbe, in a surge of chaotic rebellion, summoned Fiendfire, an uncontrollable cursed fire that devoured everything in its path. "Crabbe!" Draco had shouted, panic strangling his voice. "Are you insane?" But it was too late. The infernal blaze twisted into monstrous shapes, consuming the towering walls of forgotten objects and magic. The fire swallowed Crabbe before anyone could stop it. Draco, barely managing to escape with Goyle and with Harry's reluctant help, stood ash-covered and shaken outside the ruined room of requirement. In that moment, he said nothing. But the silence that followed him into the aftermath of war was loud with grief. Though the war ended, the ghosts it left behind lingered. Months later, during one of his private conversations with Astoria Greengrass, Draco confessed something he hadn't dared admit to anyone else. He didn't know what he was doing, Draco had said softly, his eyes fixed on the flickering fire in the hearth. "None of us did. But him. I think he was just angry. At everything. And I let him think that was strength." It would have been easy for Draco to hate Crabbe in the end. Easy to blame him for turning on him, for nearly killing them all. But Draco didn't. Because beneath the betrayal, he saw something else, a boy so twisted by the ideology they'd both been fed since birth that he'd become a weapon without aim. And Draco couldn't help but see a reflection of himself in that brokenness. "He looked up to me," Draco once told Professor Slughorn, in a quiet moment during the rebuilding of Hogwarts. "And I thought being looked up to meant being feared. I didn't teach him better. I didn't protect him." These were not the words of the arrogant boy who had once strutted through corridors like he owned them. These were the words of a young man carrying the weight of unintended consequences. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the brief but explosive scene in the room of requirement speaks volumes. "No!" yelled Malfoy, terrified, as the fire roared higher. "You'll kill us all!" But Crabbe, consumed by his own fury, did not listen. J.K. Rowling's choice to have Crabbe die by the very fire he conjured adds poetic tragedy, symbolic of how blind hatred consumes the one who wields it. After the battle, Draco avoided the spotlight. Unlike some Death Eaters, he did not attempt to justify his actions or reclaim lost glory. He retreated into a quiet life with Astoria, raising his son, Scorpius, with a different outlook, one rooted in empathy. The fact that Draco later taught his son the dangers of prejudice and the importance of choice is not coincidental. It was a lesson carved from loss, especially the loss of Crabbe. There is no official passage in the books where Draco openly mourns Crabbe, but his behavior, his choices after the war, and the way he isolates himself from the remnants of Voldemort's ideology speak louder than any eulogy. "Some scars you don't wear on your skin," he said once to Hermione Granger during a rare moment of civility years later. "Some walk behind you, reminding you what you let happen." Guilt is not always about direct action. Often it's about inaction, about the words unsaid, the guidance never given, the chance to pull someone back before the cliff. Draco knew that. He'd had the power to speak, to shape, to influence, but instead he let his own fear silence him. He let Crabbe fester in the same poison they'd all been fed, and in the end it consumed him. Astoria once found Draco sitting alone with a copy of the Daily Prophet folded beside him. It featured an article on the 5th anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts. His face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "There should have been more names on that memorial," he said. "Not because they were heroes, but because they were still human." He remembered how Crabbe used to laugh too loudly, how he always followed Draco's lead, how he once got a week of detention for hexing a suit of armor that insulted Draco's haircut. These small memories came to haunt Draco more than the war itself, because they were reminders that Vincent Crabbe hadn't always been lost. He'd just been led astray, and Draco had held the leash. During a charity event organized by the Ministry to promote post-war unity, Draco was asked to speak. Many expected him to decline, but he stood before the crowd, his hands trembling slightly, and said, "Some of us survived because others didn't. And some of us changed because we realized too late that we could have saved someone if only we'd been brave sooner." He never said Crabbe's name. He didn't have to. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Number 17, the Malfoy family, gave up dark artifacts after the war. After the Second Wizarding War, when the echo of Voldemort's name still hung heavy in the air, few in the wizarding world expected redemption from the Malfoy family. Once known for their opulence, cruelty, and pure-blood arrogance, the Malfoys had stood on the wrong side of history too many times. Lucius Malfoy, former Death Eater and once a key financier of dark agendas, had little to offer a post-war society that was eager to purge every trace of the Dark Lord's influence. And yet, against all odds, the Malfoys did something that shocked even their fiercest critics. They gave it all up. The decision came quietly at first. There was no public ceremony, no press conference. Narcissa Malfoy, with her trademark composure and icy grace, was the first to arrive at the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, carrying a single box enchanted with protective runes. In it lay a cursed opal necklace, the very one that had once nearly claimed the life of Katie Bell during Draco's 6th year at Hogwarts. Narcissa's voice was calm when she addressed Aura Williamson. "We are done with the shadows. My family no longer wishes to be the custodians of these horrors." Behind the scenes, preparations had taken weeks. Lucius, deeply humiliated and politically isolated after the war, had become a pale ghost of his former self. Stripped of the dark mark's significance, and with his influence in the ministry reduced to ash, he had little choice but to confront the legacy he was leaving for his son. It was Draco, however, who had pushed hardest for change. Haunted by the memories of what he had witnessed, what he had done, he was the one who convinced his parents that atonement had to begin with action, not words. The collection was vast and sinister. In the dark vaults beneath Malfoy Manor were items so cursed, so twisted by dark magic, that even seasoned curse-breakers hesitated to touch them. A hand of glory that whispered to itself in Parseltongue. A mirror that reflected not one's face, but their worst memory on an endless loop. Journals written in blood from the era of Herpo the Foul. One particularly feared artifact was a blackened wand fragment encased in glass, rumoured to have belonged to a student of Gellert Grindelwald. These were not heirlooms, they were remnants of a belief system steeped in pain and domination. The Malfoys' full surrender of these artifacts took over a month. Auras, under the supervision of Hermione Granger, now an official with the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Artifacts, oversaw the transfer and secure storage of each object. "It's not about trust," Hermione was reported saying during one of the inspections. "It's about accountability. The war taught us that power left unchecked corrupts absolutely, even when it hides behind silk and silver." The most symbolic moment came when Lucius himself handed over a dagger that had belonged to his grandfather, Abraxas Malfoy. Encrusted with runes that glowed when exposed to moonlight, the dagger had been used in blood rituals too vile to mention. With trembling hands, Lucius placed it into the ministry's protective case. "This," he said softly, "no longer has a place in my house." It was the closest thing to a public apology he had ever uttered. Minerva McGonagall, now headmistress of Hogwarts, was one of the first to speak publicly on the matter. "We may never forget the roles they played," she said during a Wizengamot hearing, "but we can acknowledge when someone chooses to step away from darkness. It is not an easy path." Her words, though measured, were a powerful recognition of the significance of the Malfoys' decision. Inside Malfoy Manor, changes were made. Entire rooms that had once housed cursed items were repurposed. A gallery of dark portraits, men and women who had served Dark Masters for generations, was removed. Draco converted his grandfather's private study into a conservatory filled with enchanted plants. "It was time to let the house breathe," he said in an interview with the Daily Prophet. "We needed to let light in, quite literally." But not all members of society welcomed the change. Some whispered that the Malfoys had only acted to preserve their wealth and social standing. Others believed the surrender was staged, that perhaps darker items had been hidden away in secret vaults far from the ministry's reach. Yet the wards around the manor were restructured and verified under Veritaserum-bound oaths. If the Malfoys were lying, they were doing so at an unprecedented risk. Harry Potter himself remained notably silent during the early days of the surrender, though sources close to him revealed he had met privately with Draco at an Auror office in Hogsmeade. What was said remains unknown, but a week later Harry was seen walking the perimeter of Malfoy Manor with a group of curse-breakers, ensuring every artifact had indeed been removed. "It's not about forgiveness," he reportedly told Kingsley Shacklebolt. "It's about making sure no one else suffers because of what's buried in those walls." The house elves of Malfoy Manor were the quiet witnesses to this transformation. Tilly, a small, wide-eyed elf who had served 3 generations of Malfoys, was heard muttering that she had never seen Master Draco smile before the conservatory was built. "He is planting things now," she whispered. "Flowers, not fear." One of the most telling artifacts recovered was a music box that had belonged to Lucius's mother. When opened, it played a lullaby said to lull listeners into a trance before filling their minds with nightmares. Draco had found it in a drawer of his childhood bedroom and personally delivered it to Hermione Granger. "Some memories," he told her, "aren't worth preserving." Years later, when Hogwarts hosted a special exhibition on the End of Darkness, artifacts of the Second Wizarding War, a plaque beside the Malfoy contributions read, "Donated by the Malfoy family because rebuilding begins with removal." Visitors often paused longer at that section than any other, especially near the cursed opal necklace and the Parseltongue-speaking hand of glory. Number 18, Draco openly supported Scorpius and Albus Potter's friendship. Of all the changes that time has brought to the wizarding world, few have been as moving or meaningful as the transformation of Draco Malfoy. Once known for his arrogant sneer and pure-blood superiority, Draco became, in the years after the Second Wizarding War, a different kind of man, a father, and that made all the difference. His journey is marked by many quiet acts of redemption, but perhaps none more powerful than his open support for the friendship between his son, Scorpius Malfoy, and Albus Severus Potter, the son of his old-school rival. In a world still mired in the whispers of the past, this act stood tall as a symbol of change. At Hogwarts, Scorpius and Albus were unlikely friends. One, the pale, quiet boy, burdened by whispers that he might be Voldemort's child. The other, the awkward second son of the boy who lived. Yet, From the moment they met on the Hogwarts Express, their connection was instant. "You know, I don't think I'm going to hate it at Hogwarts," Albus said hesitantly, and Scorpius smiled and replied, "That's a start." It was a quiet beginning to a powerful friendship, but it was a bond that came with cost. Rumours spread fast in the castle halls, whispers that Scorpius was not Draco's son, but rather a product of a time-turner and the Dark Lord himself created to carry on his legacy. These were more than just idle words. They were poison in the ears of students and parents alike. Even teachers exchanged uneasy glances. For a Malfoy, whose reputation was already under the scrutiny of the wizarding elite, it could have been easier, expected even, to sever ties, to steer his son away from the Potters and cling to his family's crumbling name. But Draco did the opposite. In one of the most striking moments of The Cursed Child, Draco Malfoy speaks plainly, not to a crowd, but to Harry Potter himself. He says, "My son is the most important thing in my life, and if having Albus as his friend gives him happiness, then I will defend that bond with everything I have." These are not the words of the boy who once sneered at Muggleborns and mocked Hagrid. These are the words of a father who understands that love, friendship, and acceptance are worth more than reputation. Draco's decision to publicly defend Scorpius, and by extension Albus, wasn't taken lightly. Many pure-blood families still clung to their old prejudices. They sent owls to the Malfoy estate, some polite in their disapproval, others venomous in their threats. Old allies turned cold, but Draco stood firm. He didn't respond with politics or manipulation. He simply kept standing by his son. Astoria, Greengrass, Scorpius's mother, had always been a gentler soul, someone who believed in the quiet dignity of doing what was right, regardless of bloodline. Her death left Draco not only grieving, but facing the full weight of fatherhood alone. In many ways, it was Astoria's influence that softened Draco, that whispered to him, even in memory, that love must come before legacy. There were parents at Hogwarts who demanded that Scorpius be removed from certain activities, that he and Albus be kept apart. A few even threatened to withdraw their children from the school. But Professor McGonagall, wise and unyielding, refused to bend. And Draco, perhaps for the first time in public view, made a statement at the ministry. "My son will not suffer for the sins he did not commit, and he will not be judged by the blood in his veins, but by the heart in his chest." The prophet quoted him, and the tide began to shift. In private, Draco often struggled. He would sit late in the Malfoy library, staring at old portraits of ancestors who would have disowned him for his decisions. Lucius's portrait said nothing, of course, but its silence was heavy. Yet even in these moments, Draco did not waver. For all his mistakes, he had chosen a better path for his son. There's a moment that few saw, but many felt the effects of. During a particularly tense evening at Hogwarts, after a hex aimed at Albus missed and struck Scorpius instead, Draco was seen walking the corridors of the school not as a visiting parent, but as a father on a mission. He didn't threaten, he didn't shout, he simply sat by Scorpius's hospital bed and held his hand. Later, Madame Pomfrey confided to a colleague, "He never left the boy's side, not for a minute. He looked like a man who would trade the whole world just to take his son's place." Albus and Scorpius shared a bond forged not in legacy but in loneliness, in the pain of not being what others expected. Their friendship became a lifeline. And Draco understood that in a way only someone who had lived under the weight of expectation could. In supporting that friendship, he was not only giving his son permission to be himself, he was healing a wound in the Malfoy family name. Harry Potter, too, came to understand Draco differently. Their conversations, often strained at first, softened. "We've both known what it's like to be judged before we speak," Harry said to Draco in one of their more personal meetings. And Draco, with that familiar drawl now quieted by years of reflection, replied, "Yes, but I fear it took me longer to learn not to return the favour." When Albus and Scorpius disappeared through the time-turner, it was Draco who worked side by side with Harry, Ron, Hermione and Ginny. He didn't demand credit. He didn't use it as an opportunity to restore social standing. He simply acted as a father who loved his son, and that made him an ally more than any truce ever could. Number 19, Narcissa helped hide evidence that could hurt Snape. In the days that followed the Battle of Hogwarts, as the dust settled and the dead were mourned, the wizarding world struggled to untangle the truth from the lies that had clouded so many lives. Amid the rebuilding of Hogwarts and the slow healing of broken communities, the name of Severus Snape remained steeped in ambiguity. For many, he was still the man who murdered Albus Dumbledore atop the Astronomy Tower. Few were ready to believe otherwise, even with Harry Potter's reluctant defense of the man who had protected him from the shadows. But there was one figure who took it upon herself to protect Snape's legacy in a way no one else dared: Narcissa Malfoy. Narcissa was no heroine. She was never meant to be. Her life had been defined by pure blood politics, social elegance, and the cold discipline of the Malfoy name. Yet it was precisely this position, this understanding of the power of appearances and secrets, that allowed her to move through the chaos unnoticed. It began the day after the battle, while the great hall still smelled of blood and smoke, when she slipped into Snape's private chambers at Hogwarts. The room was dark, untouched by the battle, and curiously silent. Snape had always been a private man, and few dared cross the threshold of his sanctuary. But Narcissa moved with the certainty of someone who had been there before. She knew where the documents were kept, the ones that spoke of his actions as headmaster, the correspondence with Dumbledore, the private reflections, even the copy of the unbreakable vow, sealed in a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard charmed with repelling spells. There had been rumours, of course. Some claimed Snape had acted purely out of fear. Others insisted he had betrayed both sides. But Narcissa knew better. She had seen it in his eyes the night he made the vow, with Bellatrix standing beside her, wand at the ready, her breath hot with suspicion. "Will you, Severus Snape, watch over Draco as he attempts to fulfill the Dark Lord's wishes?" Bellatrix had demanded. "Will you protect him from harm?" Snape's answer had come not with hesitation, but a weary acceptance. "I will." And then the final blow. "And should it prove necessary, will you carry out the deed the Dark Lord has ordered Draco to perform?" "I will." Snape had done it to protect Draco, to protect her family, to protect the boy from becoming a murderer. But now, with Snape gone and the truth tangled in whispers, Narcissa feared what the Ministry might do. They were rebuilding too, in their own ruthless way. There would be arrests, trials, reputations ruined posthumously. She could not allow that, not when Snape had saved her son's life more than once, not when he had risked everything in silence. And so she began. The first item she destroyed was a black leather-bound journal, written in Snape's fine, spidery script. It held everything: his orders from Voldemort, his reports to Dumbledore, his private thoughts about both. It was damning and redemptive in equal measure, but in the hands of those seeking to assign blame, it would only feed the narrative of treachery. Narcissa read it through the night, alone in the Malfoy drawing-room, tears slipping silently down her face as she learned what no one else had known. She burned it before dawn. Then came the letters, dozens of them. Some were written to Minerva McGonagall, others to Dumbledore himself, Most were never sent. In one, Snape wrote, "I have watched the boy grow under the weight of expectations he never asked for. I fear what Draco may become if he is forced to take a life. I fear what I may become if I must take it for him." Narcissa held that letter for hours before deciding its fate. She kept it, but not in the manor. It was hidden in a warded box in a disused vault in Gringotts, far from curious eyes. She worked quickly. Time was not on her side. She bribed an old archivist from the Department of Magical Law Enforcement to retrieve certain transcripts of meetings held between Death Eaters and Snape during his time as headmaster. These transcripts, taken by a charmed quill in the shadows, recorded more than strategic planning. They recorded tone, hesitation, moments of discomfort, proof that Snape had never truly belonged among the dark. Narcissa paid the archivist in cursed relics from the Malfoy collection. Dangerous, yes, but untraceable. The transcripts vanished from the Ministry's vaults that same week. It was Draco who confronted her about it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, standing in the doorway of her sitting room, watching her sift through a box of old parchments and vials. "Snape's dead, it doesn't matter now." But Narcissa turned to him, her eyes fierce with something deeper than grief. "It does matter. He saved your life. And if the world won't remember that, then we must." In a rare moment of humility, Draco nodded, and without another word, he began to help. Together they tracked down old associates, those who had once served Voldemort but had since faded into obscurity. Some were willing to trade information for gold, others for silence. They found copies of Snape's old reports to Lucius, often misunderstood as betrayal when in fact they were coded warnings. One such report detailed an upcoming raid on a Muggle family. In the margin, Snape had scrawled a barely legible note: "Delay the owl. Tell him the boy's ill." That night, the raid never happened. Narcissa gave that parchment to Kingsley Shacklebolt personally, during a quiet meeting in Diagon Alley. "He wasn't what the world thinks he was," she told the new Minister of Magic. Kingsley, to his credit, accepted it without judgment. "History often forgets its quietest heroes," he said, but even he could not promise that Snape's name would be cleared. Narcissa understood that. She wasn't looking for public redemption. She wasn't interested in changing the narrative. All she wanted was to remove the weapons that others might use against a man who had died with no one truly understanding his burden. It was not forgiveness she offered Snape, it was respect. There was one final piece to deal with, a vial of memories. Dumbledore had told her once, long before the war had turned ugly, that memories could be the most dangerous form of truth. In Snape's collection, stored in a locked drawer in his Hogwarts office, was a set of memories he had never shared with anyone. Narcissa knew about them because he had once shown her how to use a pensieve in a moment of rare vulnerability. "Some things are easier to watch than to say," he had muttered. These memories included his first conversation with Dumbledore about Lily Potter, his argument with the headmaster over Draco's mission, and the night he took the vow. They showed his pain, his conflict, his unwavering commitment to the promise he had made, to protect Lily's son, even if it meant dying hated by all. Narcissa did not destroy the memories. She couldn't. Instead, she entrusted them to an old friend, Madame Rosmerta. The woman who had once been bewitched by Draco now became the unlikely guardian of Snape's truth. "Keep these," Narcissa told her, "for the day someone brave enough asks for the whole story." Rosmerta agreed, and the memories were hidden in the cellar of the Three Broomsticks beneath barrels of fire whiskey and charm-proof wards. They remained there still, waiting. Years later, when Harry Potter gave a quiet interview to the Daily Prophet, he mentioned Snape's name once. "He was the bravest man I ever knew," Harry said. "And he never asked to be understood." The article stirred the public briefly, but only briefly. Scandals were more interesting than redemption. The public moved on, but Narcissa never did. Each year, on the anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts, she would return to the place where Snape died, the Shrieking Shack. She never said much. She would stand in silence, sometimes with Draco, sometimes alone. Once she left a letter. It read only, "You were not alone, not entirely." In the end, Narcissa Malfoy, a woman shaped by fear, privilege and survival, committed the most selfless act of her life, not for family, not for gain, but for a man the world would never thank. She cleaned his name, not with words, but with fire, ink, and secrecy. It was her way of saying, "I remember, I know who you were, and I will not let them forget." Number 20. Lucius donated a family heirloom to reconcile with the ministry. When Lucius Malfoy walked through the grand black iron gates of the Ministry of Magic that spring morning, he no longer carried the air of haughty superiority that once defined his every step. The weight of the war clung to him like a heavy cloak, invisible but unmistakable. Gone were the sweeping, confident strides. In their place were slower, measured steps. It was not merely the fear of prosecution that wore down the once proud patriarch of the Malfoy line. It was something deeper, something personal. Because Lucius Malfoy was about to part with the one item he had vowed never to relinquish, even on his deathbed. The item in question was the wand of Armando, a relic so old it was said to predate the founding of Hogwarts itself. It had belonged to Armando Malfoy, an obscure ancestor whose name was rarely spoken aloud, not for lack of reverence, but out of sheer superstition. The wand was not for use, it was for reverence. Crafted from blackthorn and capped with a serpent-shaped emerald handle, the wand was believed to possess protective enchantments layered over centuries. It was housed in a sealed glass case in the heart of the Malfoy Manor's private gallery, beneath enchantments that shimmered in silver light. Only Lucius had the key, and only Lucius had ever dared touch it. The offer to surrender the wand came not from the ministry, but from Lucius himself. It was a desperate move, and one not made lightly. The war was over, Voldemort had fallen, and the names of his followers echoed through the halls of the Wizengamot. Trials were being held daily, and although the Malfoys had technically defected in the final moments of the Battle of Hogwarts, few were inclined to forget the years of cruelty, manipulation, and unchecked power that Lucius had exercised under Voldemort's reign. The confiscation of property was already being discussed. Narcissa had overheard two ministry officials whispering at Flourish and Blots. "It's just a matter of time," they said. "Strip the Malfoys of their wealth and you strip them of their power." It was Draco who first suggested that they make a gesture. "Something visible," he told his father, pacing the drawing room nervously. "Something no one can ignore." Lucius had dismissed the idea at first. "They will take what they want regardless," he said bitterly. But Narcissa, ever perceptive, looked at Lucius and said softly, "Then let them see what you are willing to give." For 3 nights Lucius did not sleep. He wandered the manor's halls, always ending up in the gallery, standing before the glass case that housed the wand of Armando. He remembered how his father had shown it to him when he was just a boy. "This wand," Abraxas Malfoy had said, "never served a master. It serves a legacy." And Lucius had believed it. It was the one artifact in their possession that had never been used in battle, never brandished to harm. It was sacred. In the end, it was precisely this purity that made it a suitable offering. The decision sent shockwaves through the old wizarding families. "Lucius Malfoy," said Septimus Selwyn at a luncheon in Wiltshire, "has either gone mad or grown a conscience." Neither, perhaps, was true. Lucius had not changed overnight. His pride still burned within him, curled like a viper in the chest. But he understood something that perhaps even Dumbledore, in his infinite wisdom, had once overlooked, that power lies not only in what one possesses, but in what one is willing to give away. The official letter was penned on Malfoy parchment with the family crest embossed in silver. "I, Lucius Abraxas Malfoy," it began, "hereby gift the wand of Armando in perpetuity to the Hogwarts School for Witchcraft and Wizardry for the purpose of rebuilding what has been lost." It was signed in black ink, his hand trembling only slightly. The delivery was made by a trusted house elf named Gibbs, who had served the family since the time of Abraxas. Lucius could not bear to witness the handover himself. The wand of Armando was placed in a new display at Hogwarts in the main corridor near the great hall beside the shattered statue of the architect Barnabas the Balmy. A plaque read, "Donated by Lucius Malfoy as a sign of peace, memory, and hope." Some students scoffed, others stared at it in awe. Professor McGonagall, now headmistress, said little, but it was known she had personally approved the display. "Every symbol has meaning," she told Professor Flitwick, "even from a man like Lucius." The most visceral reaction came from the man himself. Lucius never spoke of the wand again, not even to Narcissa. When she brought it up once gently, he waved a hand and turned away. But he could not avoid the emptiness that spread in the manor like rot in the walls. The absence of the wand was more than spatial. It felt as if the manor had lost its anchor. "I feel it," he whispered to himself one night, fingers grazing the glass pedestal that now stood bare. "It's as if I buried a part of myself." One morning a letter arrived. It bore the seal of the Ministry's Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Kingsley Shacklebolt, acting Minister for Magic, had written it personally. "Your gesture has not gone unnoticed, Mr. Malfoy," it read. "The Ministry acknowledges your contribution to the restoration of Hogwarts and the spirit in which it was given." It stopped short of granting full amnesty, but the implication was clear. Lucius had bought his family time, space, possibility. It is important to note that nowhere in the 7 books is the wand of Armando mentioned directly. This is because its existence was hidden, even from Voldemort. "There are secrets even the Dark Lord never knew," Lucius once muttered to Severus Snape. Snape had looked at him with a rare flicker of interest. "You've kept it quiet this long. Are you prepared to never see it again?" Lucius hadn't answered. To those who believe Lucius acted only out of self-preservation, there is truth in that. But there was something else too. A need to reclaim control over his life, to redefine what it meant to be a Malfoy in a world no longer ruled by bloodlines and dark allegiances. "I've lost enough," he said to Draco during one of their late-night walks in the garden. "If losing this relic keeps your name from being dragged through the mud, then so be it." Draco had said nothing, but the silence between them was different now. Less burdened, more understanding. Years later, when Scorpius Malfoy attended Hogwarts, he would pause by the wand of Armando every morning before breakfast. Other students barely noticed. But for Scorpius it was a reminder of legacy, of sacrifice, and of quiet redemption. He once wrote in his journal, "My grandfather gave away a piece of our soul so I could walk these halls in peace. I won't forget that." There is a small footnote in Rita Skeeter's post-war Purge, the inside story that references the incident. The Malfoys, ever resourceful, found ways to sway public opinion, A token donation here, a whispered apology there. And suddenly they were no longer villains but survivors. But Skeeter, as usual, missed the nuance. What Lucius did was not mere manipulation, it was an act of penance, cloaked in pride. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, during the scene at Malfoy Manor, Voldemort uses Lucius's wand and later destroys it. "You do not seek gratitude," he hisses. "You seek redemption." In that moment, Lucius flinched, not because of fear, but because the Dark Lord had seen through him. Redemption had already become his quiet obsession. In the years following the war, Lucius became a recluse. He declined all invitations, turned down every attempt to interview or profile him. When asked by Hermione Granger, then working on reforms at the Department of Magical Justice, if he would attend a memorial at Hogwarts, Lucius wrote only 2 words: "I've paid." She never replied. There was, however, one moment of public reckoning. At a gathering of old families hosted by the Greengrasses, Lucius was introduced to a new Auror recruit. The young man, barely out of Hogwarts, looked at him and said, "My brother died in the war. I thought I'd hate you, but I saw what you gave." Lucius nodded. Then perhaps it was not in vain. That was all. No apologies, no tears. But something had shifted. The wand of Armando still rests at Hogwarts. Its serpent handle gleams under torchlight, untouched by time. Visitors pause, some out of curiosity, others out of reverence. But only a few know the full story, of what it cost, of what it meant. The gesture didn't erase the past, it didn't undo the pain or rewrite history. But it offered a fragment of hope, a whisper of change. In the end, Lucius Malfoy did not become a hero. He did not seek forgiveness from the world, but in that singular act, giving away the one thing he valued above all else, he spoke louder than 1,000 apologies. He chose his family's future over his pride. And in the world of magic, that's a rare kind of spell. Number 21, Draco personally apologized to Neville Longbottom. No one expected Draco Malfoy to return to Hogwarts after the war, let alone for anything more than a quiet, obligatory visit. Yet, in the autumn of 2000, 2 years after Voldemort fell and silence once again wrapped its arms around the battered stones of the castle, Draco came back. Not as the boy who strutted down the corridors in expensive robes, not as the sneering prefect who once delighted in the suffering of others, but as a man, pale, quiet, and very much changed. He did not come to boast or even to reminisce. He came to make peace. By then, Neville Longbottom had stayed on at Hogwarts as a herbology apprentice under Professor Sprout. The school, though partly rebuilt, still bore the shadows of the final battle. Some classrooms were sealed off, still echoing with magic gone awry. The Forbidden Forest had grown closer, darker, but the students had returned. Laughter again floated in the great hall, and house banners once more waved proudly above the tables. And Neville, awkward, brave, humble Neville, had become something of a quiet legend. The boy who had stood against Voldemort when Harry had fallen unconscious, the boy who had drawn the sword of Gryffindor and cut off Nagini's head. And Draco had seen it. He had seen Neville shine in the worst of nights. And perhaps that's what had begun to undo the twisted pride in Draco's chest. The knowledge that someone he once considered beneath him had risen to a height he himself had never reached. The story of the apology was never printed in any Daily Prophet article. It wasn't recorded in the official histories of the Battle of Hogwarts. But it lived, passed along in hushed voices between older students and professors, like a soft light flickering behind stained glass. Professor Flitwick was one of the first to mention it years later during a guest lecture. He'd been walking down the corridor near Greenhouse 3 when he spotted Draco standing alone in the courtyard, nervously fingering the hem of his cloak. "He looked like a boy again," Flitwick had said, uncertain, wrung out, as if he were about to duel himself. Neville arrived a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a dirt-streaked towel, fresh from pruning fanged geraniums. He hesitated upon seeing Draco, but didn't retreat. Flitwick, sensing the need for privacy, stepped aside and pretended to inspect a crack in the wall. What followed, according to him, was a scene so raw and sincere it stayed with him until his retirement. Draco didn't begin with small talk. He didn't ask how Neville was doing, nor mention the weather. He went straight to the point. "I was a coward," he said, his voice flat but tight. "Not just during the war, before it. Every year we spent together here I was a coward." Neville said nothing at first. He simply stared at Draco, eyes narrowed, arms crossed. It wasn't anger in his face, but the careful patience of someone who had learned, too often, to expect nothing good from such conversations. "I used to think you were pathetic," Draco continued. "I laughed when you stumbled in potions. I mocked your family. I called you names. Merlin. I even used to say you'd never amount to anything." Neville's mouth twitched, but he still didn't speak. "And then I saw you," Draco whispered. "That night, standing in front of the Dark Lord, holding the sword like it was made for your hand, and I didn't just feel ashamed. I felt like everything I believed about myself was a lie." Finally, Neville's voice cut through the wind. "It was a lie," he said. "You weren't better than anyone, Draco. You just thought you were." Draco nodded. I know now, and I've come to say, I'm sorry, not just for the insults, for the way I made you feel like you didn't matter." The silence that followed was thick. A bird chirped somewhere in the trees. The castle loomed behind them like a patient judge, listening. "I used to wish you'd fail," Neville said at last, "because I thought that if someone like you fell, people might finally see me." Draco lowered his eyes. "I did fail, spectacularly." The apology didn't end in a handshake. There were no dramatic embraces, no tearful forgiveness. But Neville, ever the quiet soul, simply nodded and said, "Thank you for saying it." The two stood for a moment longer before Neville turned and walked back to the greenhouses. Draco remained in the courtyard, unmoving, until the bell for supper rang and students began pouring out in noisy waves. Many would argue that such an apology was unnecessary, that Neville had long moved past the schoolyard taunts and cruelty. But this wasn't about the past alone, it was about what came after. Draco's apology, witnesses said, wasn't just a balm for old wounds, it was a declaration. I am no longer who I was. Even years before this moment, tiny cracks had begun to show in the mask Draco wore. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore once told Harry, "It is the unknown we fear when we look upon death and darkness, nothing more." Draco had looked upon both and seen himself in the reflection. By the time he was ordered to kill Dumbledore, he had already lost all the illusions of grandeur that came with his family name. He had trembled, hesitated, lowered his wand, and yet the healing had not truly begun until he faced the people he had hurt. Another detail often shared by Professor Sprout herself in later years involved Neville's private reflection after the encounter. She found him in the greenhouse one evening, sitting on a stool beside a sleeping mandrake, eyes distant. "He came back," he murmured. "I didn't think he would, and I didn't think I'd care, but I do." Sprout didn't press him further. Some wounds needed silence to mend. It's easy to forget that Hogwarts was not just a school. It was a forge. It shaped the future of a generation scarred by war and division. And in those hallowed halls, true change was rare but sacred. Draco's apology became one of those whispered stories the portrait spoke of at night when no one was watching. Some students dismissed it as rumour, others treated it like a parable. But those who knew, McGonagall, Flitwick, Hagrid, even a ghostly nod from nearly headless Nick, affirmed its truth with quiet smiles. Later, when Draco's own son, Scorpius, would walk the same corridors, professors noted something extraordinary. The boy had none of his father's sneer. He was gentle, curious, and kind, especially to students who were quiet, awkward, or overlooked. He reminded me of Neville, Professor Trelawney once said, but without the weight Neville carried, as if someone had cleared a path for him years earlier. Perhaps that, more than anything, was the power of Draco's apology. It didn't rewrite the past, but it reshaped the future. By confronting the truth of who he had been, Draco Malfoy gave his son the freedom to become someone better. In a quiet letter sent anonymously to the Hogwarts staff room and never claimed, someone wrote, "Regret is only useful if it plants something in its place. Otherwise, it's just decay." That letter was found tucked between pages of a worn potions manual once used by Professor Slughorn. Many believe Draco wrote it. Some say it was Neville. Others suggest it was neither, just the castle itself speaking through parchment. Regardless, the apology stands as one of those unrecorded but unforgettable moments that define a life. Not the duels or the bloodlines, not the vaults of gold or pure-blood pedigrees, but a single moment when a man chose to say, "I was wrong," and someone else had the strength to hear it. Number 22, the Malfoys helped heal the wounded after the battle. In the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Hogwarts, the castle stood as a wounded monument to war. Stone corridors once filled with laughter now echoed with groans of pain, and the great hall had become a makeshift infirmary where blood stained the marble floors. Amid the rows of cots and potion-scented linens, a quiet murmur began to pass between the healers from St. Mungo's. It was about a donation, unexpected, generous, and above all, controversial. The name whispered from cot to cot behind drawn curtains and low-burning candles was Malfoy. No one had expected them to return, not after the way Lucius had fled with Narcissa during the final battle, dragging their son behind him as Voldemort's power crumbled into ash. Yet just days later, a cloaked figure arrived at the gates of Hogwarts holding a small case of healing potions. It was Draco. He did not speak to anyone at first. He did not ask for attention. He only left the case on a table and vanished into the mist before anyone could question him. The potions were tested. They were high quality, some better than the ones brought by the Ministry. Calming draughts that stopped tremors in the hands of cursed victims. Essence of dittany more potent than anything Poppy Pomfrey had brewed. And Skelegro sealed with the Malfoy crest, enough to restore a dozen shattered limbs. It was the start of something no one could quite believe. The Malfoys, Lucius, Narcissa, and Draco, began sending more supplies every 2 days. Then they came in person. People were hesitant, said Ernie Macmillan, who had taken leave from the Ministry to help with recovery. You don't exactly expect kindness from a family who used to host Death Eaters in their drawing room. But Narcissa came with clean towels and an apron. She washed blood from the floors. She helped turn patients. She didn't talk about it. She just did it. Lucius, who had once sneered at anyone he considered beneath him, stood silently by her side. He never offered an apology, but his actions spoke in quieter volumes. He donated vials of rare mandrake restorative draught. He brought a collection of old but powerful books on curse-breaking, including one written in ancient runes that helped save the eyesight of a young half-blood girl from Ravenclaw who had been hit by a Sectum Sempra curse during the battle. There were whispers, of course. Not everyone believed in redemption. Kingsley Shacklebolt, now serving as interim minister for magic, received no fewer than a dozen letters from pure-blood families expressing outrage that those who once served darkness now dared to play the saviors. But Kingsley, known for his sharp mind and fair judgment, refused to condemn them. Redemption, he told the Daily Prophet, is proven in action, not in words. It was Draco, not Lucius, who eventually dared to speak aloud about why they had come. He was kneeling beside a young boy who had lost both his parents in the battle. The child was barely old enough to grip his wand. He had burns along his arms and trembled in his sleep. Draco passed a vial of greenish liquid to Pomfrey and said softly, "He's Muggle-born, isn't he?" When she nodded, he added, "We owe him more than this, but it's a start." The old Draco, arrogant, drawling, scornful, seemed gone. This new Draco carried bandages in his satchel. He learned the names of the wounded and remembered them. He spent hours sitting beside those who couldn't sleep, reading aloud from the tales of Beadle the Bard. It was the story of the Fountain of Fair Fortune that made one girl weep. "He sounds like he means it," she whispered. "Like he really wants to help." One afternoon, a volunteer healer from St. Mungo's, Marigold Catchlove, confronted Lucius directly. "Why now?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Why do this? Are you buying forgiveness?" Lucius looked at her for a long time, then turned away. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "Only that my hands do something other than harm, even if it's too late." The Malfoy manor, once a place of shadow and silence, had opened its gates to potion masters and herbologists. Narcissa had turned the east wing into a brewing chamber. The family's collection of rare magical plants, once hoarded for status, now supplied the war-torn school with ingredients that were otherwise impossible to find. They even sent Wolfsbane potion for Remus Lupin's son, though the child had not yet shown any signs of lycanthropy. "Just in case," Draco said. Harry Potter himself, when asked by a reporter whether he trusted the Malfoys, gave a measured reply. "Narcissa saved my life," he said. "In the forest. She had no reason to lie to Voldemort, but she did. Maybe that was the first time any of them chose something better. Maybe they're still choosing." Hermione was more skeptical. "It's a good gesture, but it doesn't erase the past." Yet even she acknowledged the difference their help had made. That draft of peace they sent? It's been the only thing that helped Ron sleep after what happened to Fred. In the quieter corners of the infirmary, where grief hung heavier than the scent of antiseptic spells, the Malfoys became part of the rhythm. They brought soup. They changed dressings. Narcissa sat with Andromeda Tonks, her estranged sister, holding her hand in silence as the two watched over baby Teddy. No words passed between them, but something older than words lingered in the air, remorse, perhaps, or simply recognition of what had been lost. A particularly moving moment came when Draco found Dennis Creevey, the younger brother of Colin. Dennis had been refusing all help, curled up in a corner behind a stack of broken furniture, his wand snapped in half. Draco knelt beside him and, without a word, held out his own wand. Dennis looked at him in confusion. "Why?" he whispered. Draco replied, "Because I'm tired of only destroying things." They did not stay long enough to see praise. The Malfoys never gave interviews, never attended any of the memorial services, and when the castle began to heal, they quietly withdrew. Their last contribution was a shipment of blood-replenishing potions, 24 vials, each sealed with the Malfoy crest, and a single note attached, "For those we cannot bring back." May their pain not be repeated. A few weeks later, when asked again by the Daily Prophet, Kingsley Shacklebolt addressed the controversy one last time. "There are debts that can never be repaid," he said, "but there are also wounds that can begin to close, not with words, not with promises, but with acts of care." The Malfoys chose to act. Years later, the story is still whispered in hushed tones. Some call it a publicity stunt. Others believe it was a true act of penance. But the survivors, those who woke screaming in the middle of the night, those who lost siblings, friends, and futures, remember the clean towels, the warm broth, the sound of Narcissa humming as she brewed potions in the early hours before dawn. And perhaps that is enough. Number 23. Draco donated Astoria's inheritance to charity. After Astoria Greengrass died, the Malfoy manor felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Its grand corridors echoed not with footsteps, but with absence. Portraits lining the walls seemed dimmer, and the usually well-trimmed hedges in the garden had started to twist into wild shapes, as if mourning alongside the house's master. For the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy walked through its gilded halls without purpose, save for the soft padding of his young son's steps beside him. Scorpius clutched a small photo of his mother, and even though he barely spoke of her, his silence thundered louder than any words. Many in the wizarding world expected the same Draco they'd known at Hogwarts. Selfish, proud, suspiciously poised, and always wrapped in the Malfoy legacy like a well-cut cloak. When Astoria passed, there was hushed gossip in Diagon Alley and louder speculation over tea at the Leaky Cauldron. "He'll tighten his grip on the vaults," one old witch whispered. "Of course he'll keep it all. That family's always been about gold and power." But they were wrong. Astoria Greengrass, gentle and thoughtful, in a way few in pure-blood society understood, had never let her husband sink into the shadows of the family name. During her illness, a rare, degenerative, magical condition inherited through the Greengrass line, she made Draco promise to raise Scorpius differently. She wanted him to grow up kind, resilient, and open to the world beyond blood status. In her final weeks, Draco spent more time reading with her than speaking. Sometimes she would fall asleep mid-sentence, a book slipping from her fingers. One night he picked up a slim, worn volume titled Curses and Compassion, Healing the Unhealable. A note was scribbled in the margin in her neat handwriting. "Start the fund after I'm gone. Promise me, Draco." 3 months after her death, the wizarding newspapers were stunned by a quiet announcement from Malfoy Manor. The statement, written not by a publicist but in Draco's own hand, declared that a significant portion of the Malfoy family fortune, specifically Astoria's share of the estate, would be transferred into the Astoria Greengrass Magical Illness Relief Fund. The fund would provide research grants and medical support for families dealing with rare magical conditions like Spindle-Hex syndrome and sanguine curse decay, 2 of the afflictions Astoria had fought against in silence. The Prophet ran the story under the modest headline, "Malfoy Endowment Supports Magical Health Fund." But the reactions were anything but modest. Within hours, letters of surprise and support flooded into the Foundation's temporary office, many of them from Muggle-born families who had never imagined the name Malfoy could be tied to charity. One mother wrote, "My son was diagnosed with Duskwither weakening last year. We thought no one cared. Thank you for proving us wrong." Inside the manor, Draco didn't care about the press. He watched Scorpius play with enchanted building blocks near the drawing-room fireplace and thought about what legacy he was crafting, not for the newspapers, not even for the memory of his wife, but for the boy with the soft eyes and a world of questions that he would one day ask. The fund wasn't just money, it was memory. He made sure the offices bore her name, a portrait of Astoria was commissioned for the entryway. Not the kind with a moving expression, but a still one, capturing the moment she had laughed in the garden with a string of wild daisies in her hair. "It's how she'd want to be remembered," Draco told the artist. Hermione Granger, now head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, met with Draco in an unexpected meeting at the Ministry shortly after the fund was established. She approached him cautiously, her brows furrowed in both surprise and curiosity. "Malfoy," she said, tilting her head, "I didn't think you capable of this." Draco replied without hesitation, "Neither did I." Later she would tell Harry, "I think he's changing. Truly, I saw it in his eyes." Harry, who had fought against Draco, saved his life, and seen the worst of him, only nodded thoughtfully. One of the first beneficiaries of the fund was a young girl named Eloise Montgomery, whose magical core had fractured due to a misfired experimental charm at birth. Her parents, Arthur and Celia, couldn't afford the stabilizing potions or the rune therapy she needed. When the grant came through, Eloise was finally able to speak full sentences without magical backlash, her voice no longer warping into echoing curses. Celia sent Draco a letter that arrived by owl just after dawn. It read, "Your wife saved my daughter's life. And you made sure she could keep doing it, even from beyond the veil. Thank you, Mr. Malfoy." He read it alone in his study, set the letter down, and simply stared out the window for a long while. Though he'd always worn fine robes and stood with aristocratic pride, Draco now looked different. He still carried himself with dignity, but the edge was softer, the eyes more tired, not from lack of sleep, but from grief ripening into purpose. When Blaise Zabini visited him later that year, he noted, "You look like your father, Draco, but you speak like your mother." Draco only nodded. From the Hogwarts Express platform, where he had once mocked others for their backgrounds, he now watched Scorpius board the train holding hands with Rose Granger Weasley. No words were exchanged between Draco and Hermione that day, but their mutual glance carried years of truce in a second. He never made speeches, never asked for applause. When Rita Skeeter requested an exclusive interview, he declined, writing, "This isn't for headlines, it's for Astoria." And it truly was. Every decision about the fund, from potion subsidies to family counseling services, was made with her voice echoing in his mind. "Let them be seen," she had once told him. "Let them feel worth, even in their suffering." Scorpius, who grew into a compassionate young man, once asked his father why the fund carried Astoria's name and not Malfoy's. Draco replied, "Because she earned it, and I am merely continuing her wish." In a quiet ceremony held on the anniversary of her passing, the Foundation opened a new wing in St. Mungo's, the Astoria wing for rare magical conditions. It was painted in soft blue hues and filled with daylight spells to keep the air warm. Every wall bore quotes from Astoria's journals. One read, "Compassion is the truest form of power." An elderly healer, Madame Alva Bristow, who had known the Greengrass family for decades, spoke at the opening. She said, "Astoria had a heart that could not be dimmed even as her magic flickered. Draco ensured her light never went out." One journalist, in a later retrospective, wrote, "Draco Malfoy, who once strutted the halls of Hogwarts with cruelty and privilege, has become one of the quiet architects of healing in our society. Perhaps redemption is not a spell, it is a choice, repeated every day." Even Lucius Malfoy, once adamant about family pride and bloodline purity, visited the Foundation headquarters in disguise one night. He did not speak to anyone. He stood before Astoria's portrait, lingered for some minutes, then disappeared into the night. The act of giving away that fortune was more than generosity. It was confession. It was a man shedding the weight of a past he didn't choose, and instead choosing love. Not the easy, romantic kind, but the hard, everyday kind that keeps promises to the dead and kindness to the living. Once, during a quiet dinner at home, Scorpius asked, "Do you miss her, Dad?" Draco didn't answer immediately. He placed his fork down and met his son's eyes. "Every day, but I see her in what we do, in who you're becoming." Scorpius nodded, thoughtful. "Then she's not really gone." Draco reached across the table, ruffled his hair, and smiled, a real smile, not the smirk he used to wear as armor. "No," he said, "she never truly left. Through the fund, through the children saved, and through the man Draco Malfoy chose to become, Astoria Greengrass lived on, not just as a name carved on a marble grave, but as a force still changing the world. And Draco, once the heir to a cold and ancient legacy, finally forged a new one, warmer, braver, and defiantly kind. Number 24. Narcissa refused to report on former classmates. After the fall of Voldemort, silence reigned over the Malfoy estate, not the silence of peace, but the heavy hush of consequences looming. Narcissa Malfoy stood by the great window of the drawing room, staring out across the withered gardens of Malfoy Manor. The war had left its mark on the land and on her heart. Her world, once built on grandeur and bloodline pride, had crumbled, and in the aftermath she was summoned, not once, but many times, by the newly restructured Ministry of Magic. She knew why. She was not naive. Though she had never raised her wand in battle, though she had not murdered or cursed or tortured, she had been there. She had walked the corridors of the Dark Lord's dominion, served him tea, heard the cries in the basement of her own home, and now they wanted her to speak, to name names, to unravel the twisted web of allies, sympathizers, and reluctant followers who had once stood behind the dark mark. In courtroom 10, where echoes of past trials still haunted the stone walls, Narcissa sat under the cold gaze of aurors, inquisitors, and ministry clerks. Kingsley Shacklebolt, now the acting Minister for Magic, watched her closely. "Madam Malfoy," he began, his voice measured but firm, "we are offering leniency in exchange for cooperation. The names of your former classmates, your associates during the war. Any detail that can assist our investigations." She met his eyes without trembling. "I understand what you want from me," she said, "but I will not give you what I do not believe in." A young clerk leaned forward. "Even names like Avery, Knott, or Selwyn? You shared a common cause." "Did we?" Her voice had the cold clarity of a winter lake. "Avery cowered in fear most of the time. Knott never lifted a wand except in defense, and Selwyn, yes, he believed in blood purity, but is belief enough to ruin a man if he never acted on it?" They didn't like her tone or her calm, but she had made a choice. At night, in the solitude of her chambers, Narcissa remembered the faces of those she was being asked to betray. Wilhelmina Burke, who had wept the night she learned her brother was killed by snatchers, though she worked for Borgin and Burke's. Elphias Travers, who had once been her friend at Hogwarts, and had cried silently in the corner of Malfoy Manor the night his daughter was taken by the Dark Lord. These were not saints, but neither were they monsters. During one hearing she was asked about Xenophilius Lovegood. The ministry had reports he had once hosted Death Eaters at his home. Narcissa raised an eyebrow. "Lovegood? That man was terrified for his daughter. He did what any parent would do. You want to prosecute him for that?" "Do you deny he helped spread propaganda against the ministry?" "I deny that he had a choice." In truth, Narcissa had made her decision long before the war ended. The moment she looked into Harry Potter's eyes in the Forbidden Forest and lied to the Dark Lord. "Is he alive?" Voldemort had asked. And she had nodded. Yes. That lie had not just saved Potter's life, it had saved her soul. "You do realize," one ministry official warned, "that withholding names could be seen as obstruction?" "And yet I speak," she answered, "because I want the next generation to inherit something better than fear." Her words were not well received. There were murmurs, threats of imprisonment, whispers that the Malfoy name should be erased. But Kingsley held them back. He had seen the war from the front lines. He understood that vengeance dressed as justice was just a new tyranny. "We are not here to start another Inquisition," he told his staff after one such session. Hermione Granger, who had taken a role as legal advisor during the post-war trials, once crossed paths with Narcissa in a narrow corridor. She was startled by how tired the older woman looked. "They think you're protecting them," Hermione said. "I'm protecting the future," Narcissa replied. "And perhaps myself." It was not easy. Many of those she refused to name were people she no longer trusted. Some she despised. But she had seen what blind accusation did. She had seen Lucius, her husband, reduced to a shell under Voldemort's rule. She had seen Draco, her son, forced to carry burdens too dark for a teenager's soul. The last thing she would do now was light a new pyre in the name of moral superiority. In one testimony, Narcissa spoke of Theodore Nott. He was a boy with a quiet heart. He hated the violence, but he feared his father more. When the time came, he hid his mother and sister in France. Is that the act of a monster? But he never opposed the regime, the wizard prosecuting her snapped. "Neither did you, sir," Narcissa said coldly. "Until it was safe." The silence that followed was deafening. Years later, when Rita Skeeter released her book The Women of the War, she described Narcissa as the frost queen who refused to melt, even under ministry heat. But she added, almost with admiration, "In the end, she may have been the only one who truly understood that justice without compassion is just another form of cruelty." Draco asked her once, "Why didn't you just say what they wanted? You could have spared us more disgrace." "Because disgrace passes, Draco," she said. "But betrayal lingers. These people, they were foolish, afraid, even wrong, but they were also human." Not everyone agreed. Molly Weasley reportedly told Arthur, "That woman has too much pride. People suffered, and she does nothing." But Arthur, who had once seen Narcissa Malfoy walk past him in the ministry with her nose in the air, said only, "Maybe that's her way of making amends." And perhaps it was. For, in refusing to name those whose crimes had not been proven, she had also refused the seductive power of vengeance. She knew that true justice required more than evidence, it required mercy. Years after the trials ended, Wilhelmina Burke opened a small tea shop in Hogsmeade. On its wall hung a single letter framed in glass. "Do not fear your name," it read. "We are all more than what we have been forced to become. N.M." When Narcissa died, the wizarding world remembered her with ambiguity. Some called her complicit, others called her courageous. But Harry Potter, who had once felt the press of her hand on his chest in the forest, said at her funeral, "She made the hardest choice, and sometimes that's all we can do." Andromeda Tonks came, though she stood at the back, unseen. She left a single lily on her sister's grave, whispering words no one heard. There were no grand monuments for Narcissa Malfoy, no stained glass tributes, no books praising her wisdom. But for those who knew what she had done and what she had refused to do, her silence was louder than any testimony. She had stood before the ministry not as a Death Eater's wife, not as a proud pureblood, but as a woman who had seen too much hate and dared to say no more. In the world of wands and whispers, of spells and silence, that made all the difference. Number 25. Lucius helped capture remaining Death Eaters. The heavy oak doors of the Ministry of Magic closed behind Lucius Malfoy with a quiet thud. No reporters were waiting outside, not anymore. The name Malfoy no longer echoed through the halls with pride or fear. It drifted like a shadow, a whisper of a legacy fraying at the edges. His cane, once a symbol of elegance and authority, now seemed a crutch, both literal and symbolic. But Lucius walked forward, chin held high, silver hair immaculate, face pale and unreadable. He had come with purpose, though few would have believed it. It was late July, just weeks after the Battle of Hogwarts had ended. Voldemort was dead, Hogwarts lay half-ruined but free, and the world was breathing again for the first time in years. Still, remnants of the Dark Lord's army were out there, hiding in caves, deserted manors, and dark forests. The Death Eaters had scattered like snakes after the head was cut off. And the Aurors? They were hunting. The Ministry, under the leadership of Kingsley Shacklebolt, was rebuilding trust and reasserting order. But catching Death Eaters wasn't easy. Most of them had vanished into the same shadows they'd once called home. Lucius knew where they were. He hadn't expected to be welcomed. When he asked for a meeting with Shacklebolt and the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the silence that followed was thick with suspicion. "Why now?" they'd asked. "Why should we believe anything you say?" But Lucius had not come to beg. He had not come to whimper or plead. He had come with names, locations, and secrets, things that could only have been known by someone who had once been inside the circle. Yaxley, Reuel, Jugson, even the elusive Corbin Mulciber, known for his cruel use of the Imperious Curse. Lucius knew where they'd last met. He had stood beside them. He had watched them flee after the Dark Lord fell to Harry Potter in the Great Hall. And in the weeks that followed, he had received owls, frantic messages from men who still believed in the old order, men asking for shelter, aid, loyalty. But Lucius gave none. He burned the letters. Then he memorized every word and went to the ministry. "They will come for me now," he had told Narcissa the night before. "When they find out, they will come. But I must do this." For years, Lucius had operated in the shadows of power, bending the law with gold and charm, masking cruelty in aristocratic courtesy. But the events of the war had cracked something in him. His home had become a prison. His son, Draco, had become a pawn. And Narcissa. She had lied to the Dark Lord himself to save Harry Potter, the very boy they were ordered to kill. That single act had changed everything. He gave the ministry the location of a farmhouse in Northumberland where Thorfinn Rule had last been seen. It was not just a rumour. Lucius had hosted a meeting there 6 months prior when the war had been reaching its peak. He gave the floor plan, the names of the owners, long imperioused, and the trapdoors used to escape if ambushed. Rule was found there 3 days later, wandless and cursing Lucius's name. Then came Jugson, tracked through a false trail of artifacts, smuggled through Nocturne Alley. "He loved old spellbooks," Lucius said coldly. "He would trade anything for a first edition Ars Obscura." A sting operation was set up. Jugson fell into the net like a moth into fire. Mulciber took longer. His paranoia had grown after the fall. But Lucius remembered one thing. He had a sister who worked at St. Mungo's. He kept a safe house 2 blocks away so he could watch her from the window without being seen. He thought it was poetic. And it was there that Mulciber was eventually found, thin, ragged, but dangerous even in silence. Lucius never asked for pardon. He didn't beg for mercy. He had no delusions about how the wizarding world viewed him. Traitor, coward, opportunist. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that he did what others like him never would. He turned on his own. One night, after a particularly grueling debriefing, Harry Potter himself walked past him in the corridor of the ministry. Lucius lowered his eyes. He expected nothing, perhaps an insult, perhaps a spell. But Harry only stopped, glanced at him for a long moment, and said quietly, "You didn't have to do this." Lucius met his gaze. "No," he replied, "I didn't." The trials began that autumn. Many of the captured Death Eaters tried to accuse Lucius in turn, dragging him into the mud as they drowned. "He was one of us," Jugson screamed during testimony. "He led meetings. He enforced the purity laws. He served the Dark Lord." Lucius stood without expression as the accusations poured. He never denied his past. That would have been a lie too cowardly even for him. "I did those things," he said calmly, "and I regret them more than you can imagine. But I am not here to defend who I was. I am here because I still believe I can do one last thing right." It wasn't enough for many. Some Wizengamot members refused to acknowledge his cooperation. Others argued he was only acting to save himself. And perhaps that was true in part. But even if his motives were tangled, the results were not. 15 Death Eaters were captured thanks to his information. 4 of them had been in hiding for over a decade. Others had gone to ground so deep only someone like Lucius could have found them. There was no Order of Merlin, no medals, no public forgiveness, but neither was there Azkaban. One of the most pivotal moments came when he gave up information on Alecto Carrow. She had escaped the Battle of Hogwarts disguised under a shifting glamour charm. She always kept a scar behind her left ear, Lucius recalled. Alecto was vain, but careless. She'd cover her face, her eyes, her hair, but she forgot the ear. He had seen her once, years before, bragging about her disguises while sipping wine at Malfoy Manor. That detail was what allowed the Auras to track her down at a remote clinic in northern Scotland, where she had been posing as a healer for magical creatures. When confronted, she reached for her wand, but was stunned by Aura Proudfoot before she could cast. Lucius had been right. Years later, Hermione Granger, then a rising star in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was asked in an interview whether the Malfoys should have been pardoned. She paused for a long moment before answering. "No," she said, "but Lucius gave us what no one else could. Without him, many of those people would still be free. Justice isn't always clean. Sometimes it comes from those we least expect." Draco Malfoy never spoke publicly about his father's cooperation, but those close to the family noticed a change. He no longer avoided his parents. He walked beside Lucius in Diagon Alley once, head high, though not smiling. It was a gesture, nothing more. But for Lucius, it was enough. In the library at Malfoy Manor, where once dark tomes had been studied and dark pacts made, there now sat a modest shelf labelled Ministry Archives. In it were the files Lucius had helped build, maps, notes, testimonies, and records of every raid his knowledge had made possible. He visited the shelf often, never touching the papers, just staring at them in silence. Narcissa once found him there in the evening light, his fingers trembling above the spine of a black dossier marked Yaxley. "He wrote to me, you know," Lucius said softly. "Begged me to help him escape, promised gold, safety, old alliances. I burned the letter. I never answered." And she simply replied, "I know." Lucius Malfoy was never a hero. He never asked to be. But in a world rebuilding from ashes, even flawed men can help lay the stones for something better. He had once sworn loyalty to a cause that promised power at the cost of morality. In the end, he betrayed that cause, not out of cowardice, but out of something harder. The bitter understanding that he had been wrong, and that fixing what was broken might mean turning the blade inward. "I have lost everything I once valued," he once told Kingsley Shacklebolt during their final meeting, "but perhaps I did not understand value until I had nothing left." The minister had nodded solemnly. "You're not forgiven, Lucius, but you are heard." And that, perhaps, was more than he ever thought he would receive. Number 26. Draco became a mentor for bullied students. When Scorpius Malfoy boarded the Hogwarts Express for the first time, Draco stood silently on platform 9 3/4, watching the red steam engine disappear into the distance. He had never felt more powerless. The castle that once gave him status and pride now looked different from a father's perspective. It was no longer just a school of magic. It was a world filled with whispers, judgments, and invisible battles. And for Scorpius, with the Malfoy name sewn into every syllable of his being, the war had already begun. Draco remembered all too well what cruelty felt like. He had been both a victim and a perpetrator. But what chilled him most was the realization that Scorpius would likely face a different kind of torment. The whispers weren't about blood purity anymore. They were about legacy, about Voldemort, about shame. Even before Scorpius unpacked his trunk in the Slytherin dormitory, he had already been labelled, and that Draco couldn't accept. He began writing to Professor McGonagall with a tone that was neither demanding nor entitled. He expressed concern, not just for Scorpius, but for all students bearing the burden of family histories. McGonagall, older and perhaps softened by time, responded with measured words. "Draco, if your intentions are sincere, perhaps your presence can be of some use." Thus began an unlikely transformation. Draco Malfoy became a frequent visitor to the school, not as a governor or benefactor, but as an unofficial mentor. He did not announce his role. He did not stand at the podium during assemblies. Instead, he met quietly with a few students at a time in one of the unused classrooms near the astronomy tower. Some came hesitantly, others not at all, but word spread. The man once feared and mocked was now listening. One of the first students he truly reached was a Ravenclaw named Elspeth Corner, granddaughter of Michael Corner. Elspeth was clever, quiet, and the target of harsh whispers. Her mother had worked in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes and had been wrongly blamed for a series of magical explosions in Diagon Alley. Though she had been cleared, the stigma followed Elspeth to school. When she arrived at Draco's door, she said nothing for 5 minutes. He let the silence breathe. Then finally she muttered, "They say I come from bad magic." Draco looked at her, his voice calm. "So did I, but bad magic isn't always born from bad people. Sometimes it comes from pain or fear or lies. And sometimes from being told who we are before we even know ourselves." He never pretended to be noble. In fact, he often began his talks with honesty bordering on brutal. "I was a coward once," he told a group of fourth years from different houses. "I let others define me, my father, my name, even the Dark Lord. I thought cruelty made me strong. I thought silence kept me safe. I was wrong." He paused, eyes scanning the students. "So I'm here now, not to erase my past, but to help you carry yours without becoming it." Some found it strange. Draco Malfoy, of all people, acting as a guide for the bullied. But those who heard him speak knew there was no performance. He had no desire for praise. He told stories of how he mocked others to gain favor, how he let fear twist his choices. He once recounted how he cornered a boy named Colin Creevey, in a corridor, sneering at his muggle-born status. I still remember the look in his eyes, not fear, just disappointment. I was 13, I thought I was clever. A Hufflepuff boy named Amos Diggle, whose stammer had made him the subject of daily mockery, once asked Draco, "Do you think people ever really change?" Draco didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I don't know, but I know people can make different choices, and sometimes that's the same thing." His sessions grew into something like confessions, not only for the students, but for Draco himself. He never forgave who he had been at 16. But in guiding others, he began to rebuild himself. "Don't fight darkness with more darkness," he told a Slytherin girl who had hexed a boy for calling her names. "That's how I spent my youth." All it earned me was regret. Scorpius, too, was changed by this. Though he never attended his father's sessions, Draco insisted on that boundary. He began hearing about them. And one night, during Christmas break, he asked quietly, "Do you think you were a bad person?" Draco sat down beside him. "I think I was a broken boy pretending to be strong, and I think I don't want that for you." There were still whispers, of course. Some parents wrote angry letters to the school. "A Death Eater guiding our children," one letter read. But McGonagall, in a rare moment of open emotion, responded with 5 words: "He is guiding them away." Perhaps the most poignant moment came when Albus Potter, yes, that Albus, asked if he could attend one of Draco's talks. The tension in the room was thick when Albus entered. Draco paused mid-sentence. The son of his school rival stood in front of him, arms crossed, gaze steady. "I don't like you," Albus said, "but Scorpius says you helped." Draco nodded. "That's enough for me." And in time he did help. Students stopped hiding in bathrooms. Letters home no longer trembled with unspoken fears. A boy named Tobias Fletchley, nephew of Justin Finch Fletchley, once said, "When I sit with him, I feel like he sees the real me, not who people say I am." Draco had changed the way Hogwarts felt for many. Not through power or spells, but through presence, through his raw, unfiltered truths. He often quoted an old line Dumbledore once said to Harry, "It is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." Draco lived by that now, and he shared it not as a moral lesson, but as a lifeline. When the anniversary of the Battle of Hogwarts came, many students gathered to light candles. Draco was invited to speak, but he declined. Instead, he stood at the back of the Great Hall, watching the flames flicker. Elspeth found him and asked why he hadn't spoken. He replied, "Because this is your time. I've already said too much in my life. Now it's your voices that matter." There were moments when he still felt the sting of who he had been. Old habits rose in quiet thoughts, but he fought them. Not with pride or arrogance, but with humility. With each child he helped, a piece of the Malfoy legacy was rewritten, not erased, but reformed. In the end, Draco became something few had expected, a protector, not of tradition, not of family name, but of the vulnerable. He had once lived by the code of fear. Now he lived by the quiet strength of compassion. No longer the boy who mocked, or the youth who fled, Draco Malfoy walked the halls of Hogwarts as a man who understood pain and who refused to let it take another victim. That, perhaps, was the real magic. Number 27. The Malfoys funded the restoration of the Hogwarts Library. Of all the headlines that stirred the wizarding world in the years after the Second Wizarding War, none were as unexpected or as emblematic of deep transformation as the one printed in the Daily Prophet on a chilly morning in early September. The Malfoy family donates to rebuild Hogwarts Library. To most witches and wizards, the name Malfoy had long been synonymous with blood purity, elitism, and a disdain for anything remotely connected to Muggles. But now they were funding a wing dedicated not only to magical history, but specifically to Muggle studies, the legacy of Muggle-borns, and even books promoting tolerance and unity. For many, it was a gesture too strange to be genuine. For others, it was the beginning of something new. In the weeks following the article, wizarding publications buzzed with speculation. Some saw it as a desperate PR move, a strategy by Lucius Malfoy to clean the family name, still soiled by his Death Eater past. Others suspected a ministry bargain. But for those who had actually stepped foot in the newly built East Wing of the Hogwarts Library, there was no mistaking the sincerity of the donation. Carved in white marble at the entrance, above enchanted double doors of polished cedar, were the words, "Knowledge is the light that burns prejudice away." It was Draco Malfoy, not Lucius, who stood at the inauguration of the new library wing on the first day of the school year. Dressed in tailored grey robes, a simple silver serpent pinned to his collar, Draco looked older than his 31 years. Gone was the smugness of his youth. He didn't speak long, but every word carried a weight far beyond its length. "Books," he said, "are how we remember, and sometimes how we redeem. My family has much to remember, and much to redeem." Behind him stood Hermione Granger, then Deputy Head of Magical Education, and her presence was perhaps the clearest signal that this was not a charade. She had personally overseen the project, from curating titles to enchanting protective spells on first editions. It had been her idea to include an interactive archive of oral testimonies from Muggle-born witches and wizards who had suffered under Voldemort's regime, and it was Draco who approved it. "I never thought I'd be building something with a Malfoy," Hermione admitted during her speech, "let alone building a sanctuary for ideas he once called dangerous, but this is what change looks like." Within the first month, over 70 new books were added to the East Wing collection, many from private collections thought lost. Among the rarest was Between Two Worlds, a study of Muggle-born identity, by Alara Moonwell, a Muggle-born Ravenclaw who had fled Britain during the war and returned only after the fall of Voldemort. Another title, Crossroads of Blood, an unbiased genealogical review, challenged centuries of pure-blood supremacist assumptions. The inclusion of this book, once banned from Flourish and Blots by decree of the old ministry, was seen by many as a direct rejection of the ideology the Malfoys had once defended. One of the most personal additions to the wing was a letter Draco allowed to be displayed, written in his own hand, dated 3 years after the Battle of Hogwarts. In it, he described the night he failed to identify Harry, Hermione, and Ron at Malfoy Manor. "That hesitation," he wrote, "was not an act of bravery. It was a moment of clarity. For the first time, I saw how small and false the world I had inherited truly was." Students, especially those from Muggle families, spoke of how the new wing changed their experience of Hogwarts. Evangeline Parks, a third-year Hufflepuff whose father was a non-magical police officer, said, "For the first time, I feel like this school wants me here, not just tolerates me." Her favourite book was Electricity and Enchantment, How Muggles Light the Dark Without Magic, a beginner's guide to Muggle technology, complete with enchanted diagrams and a special section by Arthur Weasley. There were skeptics, of course. Portraits of long-dead pure-blood scholars frowned from their frames as students leafed through pages celebrating Muggle-born inventiveness. One painting, a particularly arrogant ancestor of the Black family, had to be removed after loudly proclaiming that all this tolerance would rot young brains. But McGonagall, now headmistress, stood firm. "Let them see what progress looks like," she said with a proud smile. "Let the walls remember something new." When asked why the family didn't rename the wing after themselves, Draco replied simply, because it's not about us anymore. Still, he couldn't prevent Hermione from quietly embedding a small plaque behind one of the columns. It read, "For the children who read, and for those who chose to change." Behind the scenes, much of the funding came from the sale of several Malfoy-owned artifacts, many of which had been collected by Lucius during the height of his power. Some were dark objects, others rare books with histories too heavy for comfort. According to Gringotts records, the Malfoy vault had shrunk by nearly 20% in the months preceding the donation. To many, that statistic carried more meaning than a dozen press releases. In the staff room, the professors shared mixed reactions. Professor Binns, still half oblivious in his ghostly routine, declared it unprecedented and vaguely confusing. Professor Flitwick, on the other hand, applauded the decision. "Redemption is best earned through work," he said, "and what better work than making knowledge free?" The Slytherin students, especially the younger ones, found themselves at a crossroads. Many had grown up hearing whispers of their house's tainted legacy. Now they saw their prefect, Scorpius Malfoy, helping first years find books on wizard-muggle cooperation. "My dad says courage isn't just fighting," Scorpius told a new student once. "Sometimes it's unlearning things." One unexpected ally in the project was Luna Lovegood, who had donated several rare manuscripts from the Quibbler's early days, including articles titled "Magical Misconceptions, 10 Muggle Truths," and "The Crumple-Horned Snorkack was a metaphor all along." Her writings were placed in a corner humorously labelled "Speculative Realities." The East Wing also began hosting lectures open to the public. One of the most attended was delivered by Dean Thomas, who recounted his own experiences as a Muggle-born during the war. "When they tried to make us feel small," he said, "I remembered my mum's stories. I remembered where I came from, and now I get to tell my story in these walls." For many Hogwarts alumni, walking into the wing was emotional. Hannah Abbott, now the landlady of the Leaky Cauldron, visited with her young niece. "When I was a student," she said, "there was no shelf for our kind of stories. Now there's a whole wing." Lucius Malfoy remained largely absent from public events. A rare photograph captured him standing in the East Wing late one evening, fingers brushing the spine of a Muggle history book, his expression unreadable. Narcissa, however, was more open in her support. "This," she said during a tea with McGonagall, "is something we should have done long ago." Harry Potter himself visited the wing in its second year. There was no grand speech. He walked through the shelves, pausing at "The Children of Resistance, How Young Witches and Wizards Fought Back." A student later swore she heard him say, "I wish this had been here when I was 11. One curious addition to the wing was a magical map, charmed to update weekly, that tracked cross-cultural magical discoveries. Spells from Africa, potions from South America, Muggle innovations that inspired wand modifications, all recorded in glowing ink. The map was a tribute to the interconnectedness of all magical peoples regardless of origin. The true success of the Malfoy-funded wing was not in its collection, but in its silence. A silence filled with reading, with reflection, with students whispering questions they never dared to ask before. No curses lingered in this space, no echoes of the war, only the rustle of turning pages and the quiet bravery of those learning to think differently. Years later, when Scorpius Malfoy graduated and left Hogwarts, he donated his own notes on wizard-muggle integration theories to the library. He wrote in the margin of one book, "A library isn't just where you find truth. Sometimes it's where you leave pieces of yourself behind." And so the East Wing stood, quiet, resolute, and brave in its own way. A monument not to wealth, but to change. A testimony not to guilt, but to growth. And above all, a space where the next generation of witches and wizards could learn not just how to cast spells, but how to undo them, especially the ones written into minds, into hearts, and into history. Number 28. Draco became Harry's ally against a new threat. It was never written in the stars that Draco Malfoy would fight beside Harry Potter. And yet one evening, heavy with time-turners, secrets, and the weight of broken legacies, they stood side by side. Their wands drawn not against each other, but against something far darker, something that threatened everything they had fought to preserve. It wasn't about glory anymore. It wasn't about bloodlines or schoolhouse rivalries. It was about their children, about Hogwarts, about a world that could not afford to fall again. In The Cursed Child, Draco is no longer the sneering boy behind a silver badge and a darker ambition. He is a father, broken, healing, and quietly brave. When his son, Scorpius Malfoy, vanishes alongside Albus Potter after stealing a powerful, illegal time-turner, Draco's world begins to unravel. But unlike the man he once was, he doesn't react with rage. He doesn't seek revenge. He seeks alliance. He seeks Harry. Their meeting is tense, brimming with the ghosts of old grudges. "I don't care what you did or didn't do," Draco says, his voice firm. "I care that my son is missing." There is something haunting in his eyes, regret perhaps, or the wisdom time often brings too late. Gone is the boy who mocked. Before Harry stands a man who has suffered the quietest grief of all, watching his child become isolated by a name he did not choose. Their mission is not simple. Delphi Diggory, the self-proclaimed daughter of Lord Voldemort, seeks to rewrite history. With the time-turner in hand, she aims to bring the Dark Lord back by saving Cedric Diggory, twisting time, fate, and memory to achieve her ends. And for a brief, terrifying moment, she succeeds. The world blurs. Albus and Scorpius disappear into fractured timelines, and it is Draco who insists on action. In one of the most telling moments, when the Ministry tries to suppress the panic, Draco raises his voice, not with arrogance, but with controlled fury. "If you won't act, then we will," he declares, stepping closer to Harry. "I have as much right to protect this world as you do." Hermione, now Minister for Magic, doesn't argue. She nods. Even Ron, who had never once trusted Draco, looks at him differently. Perhaps there are some battles that dissolve old suspicions. What follows is a strange and dangerous dance with time. They follow the boys into the past, into the very night the Tri-Wizard tournament unfolded. As they track Delphi, they encounter versions of their world where everything is wrong. In one timeline, Cedric becomes a Death Eater. In another, Voldemort reigns supreme. Harry is dead. Hermione is a warrior in hiding. And Draco is broken, a shell. These glimpses shake them all, but it is Draco who, upon seeing a world where Scorpius is gone, falls to his knees in grief. And yet it is also Draco who recovers fastest. He refuses to let despair slow them down. "My son lives," he whispers, "and I will find him." What strikes the reader most about Draco during these moments is his quiet courage. He does not seek the spotlight. He does not bark orders. He moves with purpose, but without pride. Even Harry notices. In one hushed exchange at Godric's Hollow, Harry says, "You're braver than I thought." Draco smirks, the echo of his old self flickering. "I'm not brave. I'm a father." Their journey together is not merely a chase through time, but a healing of wounds too long left to fester. They argue. Of course they do. Draco reminds Harry that he was not the only one who lost during the war. "You had friends. I had expectations. Do you know what it is to be raised for greatness and then watch it all rot?" It is not self-pity. It is confession. and Harry listens, perhaps for the first time. One of the most powerful moments comes when Draco stands over the grave of his wife, Astoria. He speaks of her illness, of how the purity of blood she was born into did nothing to protect her. "She made me promise," he says softly, "that I would raise Scorpius to be different, to be kind, and he did." Scorpius, with his wit, his awkward charm, and his undying loyalty to Albus, is living proof that Draco succeeded where many had failed. Their final confrontation with Delphi happens in the past, October 31st, 1981, the night Voldemort murdered James and Lily Potter. Delphi seeks to stop Voldemort from going to Godric's Hollow. She believes that if she can keep him from that fatal act, he will live, and she will rise beside him. It is Draco, not Harry, who devises the plan to trap her. "She worships him," Draco notes. "Then let's give her what she wants, a chance to meet the Dark Lord himself." The trap is set. Delphi is lured into the church where Voldemort is expected, and there, with united wands and one fierce spell, they stop her. In the quiet aftermath, as Delphi is taken away, Harry turns to Draco. "You didn't have to be here," he says. Draco, staring at the sky where the stars are beginning to appear, replies, "No, but I chose to be." There is no triumph in his voice, only peace. When they return to the present, everything has changed and nothing has. The scars are still there, the memories still burn. But now there is understanding. A bridge where once there was only war. One of the final scenes has Draco standing beside Harry at platform 9 3/4. They watch as their sons laugh, elbowing one another as they board the train. "They'll be all right," Harry says. Draco nods. "They're better than we were." It is this quiet alliance, forged not of convenience but of mutual love for their children, that defines Draco's evolution. He has grown from a boy who craved legacy into a man who values truth, from someone who wielded cruelty as a shield into someone who now uses wisdom as a weapon. There's a passage in The Cursed Child that perhaps says it all. After the dust settles, Draco tells Harry, "We have the same scars, Potter, different battles, but the same pain. Maybe we weren't meant to be friends, but we are fathers, and that makes us allies." It is not forgiveness, but recognition. And that is sometimes more powerful. Even Albus and Scorpius, through their journey, mirror this transformation. The sins of the fathers, so often passed down like cursed heirlooms, are broken here. Scorpius, ever loyal, speaks of his father not with fear or shame, but with pride. "He's not who you think he is," he tells Albus once. "He's complicated. Aren't we all?" Draco Malfoy did not fight in the war beside Harry, but he did something just as vital. He chose, long after the ashes had cooled, to stand on the right side of history. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And when that moment came, when time turned against them and shadows rose again, Draco stood not behind Harry, not before him, but beside him. It is tempting to remember Draco only as the villain of the early books, the boy who called Hermione a mudblood, the boy who jeered at Hagrid and plotted in shadows. But to do so would be to deny him the journey he earned. For isn't that the very heart of the wizarding world, the belief that we can change, that we can choose to be better no matter where we began? In the end, Draco did not ask for praise. He did not seek redemption. He simply fought for what mattered. And in doing so, he became not just an ally, but a hero, quiet and unspoken, in the tale that never truly ends.